When you think about philosophy, it's fascinating, isn't it? How these big ideas, they kind of echo through time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
You encounter them across different periods and you think, wow, how does this fit? How do I make sense of this in my own time?
And not just like, translating the words, but like the whole way they thought, right? Their framework for understanding the world.
Yeah, their whole worldview, their assumptions, it's a
Yeah.
challenge.
And that's kind of what we're looking at today with Judah Abrabanel, also known as Leone Abreu. I was looking at the sources you sent, and it just seems like right off the bat, he's at this really interesting crossroads.
He is. He's a transitional figure. Judah Abrabanel lived roughly 1465 to sometime after 1521. And yeah, he's right between these medieval Jewish philosophical traditions and then all this new stuff coming in with the early modern period.
All those exciting but kind of confusing new ideas.
Exactly, like Renaissance Platonism, right?
Yeah.
Huge emphasis on these transcendent realities. And then you've got humanism, which is all about human potential, going back
Ugh.
to the classics.
So he's going to make sense of all of that.
He does. And what's so interesting for us, thinking as philosophers, is that he's drawing on all these different sources. You see Renaissance Platonism, you see humanism, but you also see his deep roots in Jewish and Islamic philosophy.
It's like he's building these bridges, trying to connect these different worlds of thought.
He is, and it makes understanding his work so much more layered, so much richer.
Okay, so let's get into his most well-known work, the Dialogi d'Amor, Dialogues of Love. It's a philosophical exploration, but in this kind of romantic-sounding package.
Yeah, the title itself, it already kind of pulls you in, right?
It does. And you mentioned this fits into a specific genre in the Renaissance, the Trattato d'Amor. What's that all about?
So Trattato d'Amor literally means treatise on love, and it was a big deal during the Renaissance. These accessible, almost conversational writings about love, often philosophical, sometimes not.
So not your typical dense philosophical treatise.
Exactly. This style really allowed thinkers like Abrabanel to take these big, sometimes complex philosophical ideas about love and bring them to a broader audience.
Make them more relatable, I guess.
Yeah. And the dialogi, it really showcases this. It's this deep philosophical discussion, structured as 3 dialogues. Though some scholars think maybe there was originally a 4th one, and the whole thing unfolds between 2 courtiers, Philo and Sophia.
So it's almost like eavesdropping on this very elegant, very philosophical conversation about love.
That's a great way to put it. And they really go deep. They talk about love as this sensual experience, something we feel, but also as this huge cosmic principle.
Sensual and cosmic, that's quite a range. You also pointed out that Sophia, she's not just there to listen, she's actively part of the philosophical discussion, which seems kind of unusual for the time.
Yeah, very unusual. Sophia, she's not just a passive character. She's asking questions, pushing back on Philo's ideas. She's really driving the conversation forward.
She's a philosopher in her own right, then.
Absolutely. And the dynamic between them is really interesting, too. Philo is clearly trying to answer her questions, address her arguments about love, but there's this layer of physical attraction, too, right? He's clearly drawn to her.
It's a philosophical dialogue with a romantic subplot.
Exactly. But that's not just for entertainment. It actually reflects something deeper that Abrabanel is trying to say about the connection between worldly desire and this deeper, almost spiritual longing.
He's tying these themes of love, beauty, desire right into the structure of the work itself.
Brilliantly.
So, okay, let's say we're coming at this as philosophers wanting to understand Abrabanel. What should we be paying attention to as we dig into his ideas? What's our mission here, philosophically speaking?
Our mission, I think it's to really uncover what makes Abrabanel's philosophy distinctive. We need to get to his core ideas, how he builds his arguments. And to do that, we always have to keep in mind the context, right? The world he lived in, the philosophical traditions he's drawing on.
It's like understanding the soil this plant grew in.
Perfect analogy. So we're looking at how he takes all these influences and transforms them into something new, something that gives us this unique window into how philosophical ideas evolved, particularly during a period of such intense intellectual change.
A period of huge change, right? You mentioned this debate about Jews in Renaissance culture. Were they integrating? Were they more of a persecuted minority? How does that affect how we understand someone like Abrabanel, a Jewish philosopher, in this setting?
That's a great place to start because there are these 2 main perspectives, right? One view is that the Renaissance was this time of, well, potential synthesis, right? Where Jewish intellectuals could really participate in the broader culture while still holding on to their identity.
So they could draw from these new ideas without completely losing themselves.
Exactly. And this view, it suggests that thinkers like Abrabanel, they kind of just took up those ideas,
Yeah.
integrated humanism and Neoplatonism into their own thought.
Just kind of absorbed it.
Yeah. But then the opposite view, it emphasizes that Jews were still a marginalized group. They were often persecuted. And this perspective, it tends to see Jewish Renaissance thinkers as being much more tied to medieval Jewish traditions, particularly Maimonides.
So any synthesis or integration with these new Renaissance ideas was more superficial, more strategic.
Right, almost like a way to navigate a difficult social and political landscape. So you've got these two very different lenses through which to understand Abrabanel's work and how he fits into the broader intellectual currents of the Renaissance.
It's fascinating how a difference in perspective can lead to such distinct interpretations.
Absolutely. And neither is entirely wrong. So there's this productive approach that tries to find a middle ground, right?
Something a bit more nuanced, I imagine.
Yes, it suggests that for some elite Jews in Italy, the Renaissance opened up some genuinely new possibilities. They could access new literary forms like the Trattato, different philosophical categories, and even engage with these new educational ideals.
And they use these new tools to re-examine and articulate their own traditions in new ways.
Precisely. It wasn't necessarily about totally merging with the broader Renaissance culture, but more about this dynamic back and forth, this creative engagement, where they use the ideas of the Renaissance to deepen and reframe Jewish thought.
That sounds much more like a genuine intellectual exchange. So, who was Judah Abrabanel as a person? What kind of life experiences might have shaped his philosophical views?
Well, he was born in Lisbon, probably between 1460 and 1470,
Yeah.
and his father, Don Isaac Abrabanel, was a very prominent philosopher himself, known for a more conservative approach to theology.
So intellectual discussion was part of family life from the beginning.
You could say that. And interestingly, even though Don Isaac was wary of certain aspects of philosophy, he made sure Judah got a really broad education. He studied Jewish texts under Rabbi Joseph ben Abraham ibn Hayun.
A serious foundation in the Jewish tradition.
Yes. But he also delved into non-Jewish intellectual traditions. The Arabo-Judaic philosophical heritage like Maimonides and Averroes and the humanistic studies from Italy.
So a truly well-rounded education, very much in line with the Renaissance ideal.
Exactly. And professionally, Judah was a highly respected physician, even serving in the royal court. A physician and a philosopher, a fascinating combination.
A true Renaissance man. But then, there were those expulsions, which must have been a huge upheaval.
Yes, in 1483 there was some political turmoil, and the family fled to Seville. Don Isaac was a very resourceful guy. He soon became a financial advisor to the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella.
Right at the heart of power, but also a precarious position to be in.
Very much so. And despite his influence, he couldn't stop the Alhambra Decree in 1492, which expelled all the Jews from Spain. It was a devastating event for the Jewish community. Judah, because of his court connections and his work as a physician, he was actually given the option to stay in Spain if he converted.
So an incredibly difficult decision to make, to stay and abandon his faith or to leave everything behind.
Exactly, an impossible choice. And then, to add to the tragedy, there was this plot to forcibly convert his oldest son, Isaac. Judah tried to keep him safe by sending him to Portugal, but he was captured and baptized against his will under King Joao II's orders.
Oh, wow. Just a heart-wrenching situation.
It was. And Judah pours out his grief and anguish in this powerful poem called Taluna al-Hazman, The Travails of Time. He writes about his heart being pierced, his family scattered, just utter devastation. You really get a sense of the personal turmoil behind his philosophical work.
Yes, it adds another layer of depth to his writing. So eventually he settled in Naples.
He did. Like many who held on to their faith, he and his family ended up in Naples. Their international connections helped them to be welcome there. But even Naples wasn't a safe haven. There was so much political instability. When the French took over Naples in 1495, Judah was forced to flee again, traveling all over Italy, Genoa, Barletta, Venice.
Always on the move, seeking safety and stability.
Imagine the impact on his writing, on his thinking. He spent time in Tuscany, though it's unlikely he ever actually met Pico della Mirandola, although some people have suggested that. After the French were kicked out of Naples, he went back and became the viceroy's personal physician. And amidst all this turmoil, he wrote the Dialoghi d'Amore. It wasn't published in his lifetime, though.
Wow, to find the space for philosophical reflection in the midst of such upheaval is incredible.
It really is. He died sometime after 1521, and we don't know much about his final years. Oh, and there was this later edition of the Dialogue that claimed he converted to Christianity. But most scholars think that's not true. There's evidence in the Dialogue itself that suggests he remained faithful to Jewish law.
So another layer of mystery and intrigue. And what about the language of the Dialogue? As philosophers, we care about the nuances of language, right? There's been some back and forth about whether it was first written in Italian, Latin, or even Hebrew.
A big question. And you're right, the language really matters. So, while some have argued for Latin, maybe because of his medical background, or Hebrew, based on some contemporary references, the evidence really points to Italian being the original language.
So Italian it is.
Most likely, yeah. I mean, all the manuscripts we have, including the first one that was published, they're all in Italian. Plus, he'd been living in Italy for almost 20 years when he wrote it. He must have been fluent, especially since he already knew Latin and Spanish.
He was probably fluent in quite a few languages.
I'd imagine. Plus, during the Renaissance, more and more Jewish intellectuals started using vernacular languages to reach a wider audience, including Jews who weren't as comfortable with Hebrew anymore.
It's like he's trying to make these philosophical ideas more accessible to a wider audience.
Exactly. And the genre itself, the Trattato d'Amore, was an Italian thing. So it makes sense that he'd write it in Italian to participate in that specific literary tradition.
Okay, so we've got this rich backdrop, his life story, the intellectual landscape of the time. Let's get to his philosophy now. You said one of the things that stands out about him is that he's not really caught up in that faith versus reason debate that was so big for medieval philosophers.
Right. That whole tension between faith and reason, it was a defining feature of medieval Jewish philosophy.
I mean, it seems like a pretty fundamental question. Can you use reason to understand faith? Can they coexist?
Exactly. And it caused a lot of debate, especially after Maimonides. Some thinkers thought, yes, bring in philosophy, let's use reason to understand our faith. Others saw it as a real threat to tradition.
Like opening a Pandora's box.
And Abrabanel's own father, Don Isaac, he was deeply involved in these controversies. He was really defending traditional Jewish doctrine against what he saw as the dangers of philosophical radicalism.
It makes you wonder what dinner table conversations were like in that family.
I know, right? But Judah, he doesn't seem to get bogged down in this debate the same way.
So what's going on there? Why this shift in focus?
I think it has to do with this big idea that was circulating in the Renaissance, this concept of Sophia perennis. It's often translated as perennial philosophy. And it essentially says there's this underlying unity of truth.
So all these different paths, whether it's faith or reason or even ancient wisdom, they all lead to the same truth.
That's the idea. And it was really popular among those Florentine humanists. They saw this beautiful harmony between ancient wisdom and revealed truth.
And does Abrabanel really buy into this idea?
You see it all over his work. The way he uses biblical passages to back up his philosophical arguments, and then he'll turn around and use philosophy to make sense of the Bible. It's all woven together for him.
It's like he's saying it's not an either, it's a both hand.
Exactly. He's working within this framework of harmony. So that sharp conflict between faith and reason that was so central to medieval thought, it just doesn't have the same hold on him.
It's fascinating how a shift in the overall understanding of truth can reframe those long-standing debates. And you said this idea of Sophie Prentice, it also influenced his view on philosophical esotericism.
Absolutely. If you believe that truth can be found in all these different places, that it's not just for a select few, then the idea of keeping philosophy secret, esoteric, it loses its appeal. For Abrabanel, even metaphysics, which was traditionally seen as very esoteric, becomes something that anyone can and should engage with.
It's like democratizing knowledge, making it available to everyone.
And he walks the walk too.
Yeah.
Look at Sophia in the Dialogue. She's a woman, and she's actively participating in these philosophical discussions. He's clearly saying everyone, regardless of gender or background, can participate in the search for truth.
It's a radical idea for the time, even if he doesn't explicitly frame it that way.
Very true. And then there's that other interesting thing you mentioned, his engagement with Greek myth. That's not something you typically see in Jewish philosophical writing from this period.
It does seem a bit unusual. What was he doing with that?
Well, there was this big revival of interest in Greek and Roman classics during the Renaissance, and Abrabanel was definitely part of that. But he approached it in his own unique way, through a Jewish lens. On one level, he's trying to show that there's this deep harmony between Greek myths and the teachings of the Torah.
Like they're both telling the same story, just in different ways?
In a way, yes. But he also makes this even bolder claim. He argues that the Greeks actually got their wisdom, their philosophy, from the Israelites and then kind of distorted it.
So he's turning the tables on the traditional view of the Greeks as the original source of wisdom.
He is. Like, he specifically says that Plato, when he supposedly traveled to Egypt, he probably studied with some learned Israelites. And he claims that Plato's famous myth of the androgen in the Symposium, it's actually just a messed up version of the Adam and Eve story from the Torah.
That Plato stole the idea, basically.
Basically, he accuses Plato of taking this idea, embellishing it with all this fancy Greek rhetoric, and ending up with this confused version of the original Hebrew story.
Wow, he doesn't pull any punches.
He doesn't. So what's he trying to do here? I think it's two things. First, he's trying to establish the primacy of the Jewish tradition. He wants to show that it's the original source, the foundation for Western thought.
He's reclaiming the narrative, so to speak.
Exactly. And second, he's pushing back against the dominant Christian interpretations of the Bible that were popular during the Renaissance. Thinkers like Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, they were reinterpreting the Bible through a very Christian lens.
So he's saying, hey, hold on, there's another way to understand these texts, the original Jewish way.
And he suggests that maybe this Jewish understanding is actually more in line with the true spirit of the Renaissance than these Christian interpretations. He's implying that Jews and non-Jews alike can find common ground in these ancient truths.
That's a really interesting perspective. Okay, let's move on to his core concepts. Beauty and love. You mentioned these are like technical terms for him, not just emotional fluff. And they're deeply intertwined.
They are. Bellezza, beauty, and amor, love. These are the foundations of his whole philosophical system. He filters every topic, every discussion through these ideas.
They're like lenses through which he sees the world.
A great way to put it. And he sees them as inherently linked. He actually defines beauty as that which delights the mind, that recognizes it and moves it to love. So for him to really understand something, you have to be moved by love. And that love is sparked by beauty.
So it's a cyclical process. Beauty leads to love, and love deepens understanding.
Exactly. They work together, these two forces. They're both cognitive and emotional.
Okay, so how do we perceive beauty? Do all our senses have equal access to this philosophical kind of beauty?
Not for Abrabanel. He ranks the senses. He says the lower senses, touch, taste, smell, they can't grasp true beauty in the same way that the higher senses can sight and hearing.
So there's a hierarchy of the senses.
There is. And then even beyond sight and hearing, you have the imagination and the intellect. These are the faculties that can really get at the heart of beauty, what he calls incorporeal beauty.
So physical beauty is important, but it's just a stepping stone to something more profound.
Exactly. Whether it's a beautiful face, a beautiful melody, or even beautiful speech, these physical manifestations of beauty, they point to this higher incorporeal beauty that ultimately resides in the divine. And love, that's the force that drives us, that guides our souls and our intellects as we climb this ladder of beauty, from the physical to the spiritual.
Love is the engine of the soul, the force that propels us upwards. So let's talk about his philosophy of beauty in more detail. You mentioned that there was this shift in how people thought about rhetoric, aesthetics, and even the imagination during the Renaissance. How did that play out in Abrabanel's work?
Right. So in medieval times, rhetoric, it was seen as kind of basic, a stepping stone to the more important stuff like metaphysics. But in the Renaissance, that whole idea changed. Eloquence became a sign of wisdom. A good speaker was expected to know a lot about lots of different things.
They had to be well-rounded.
Exactly. So Jewish thinkers at the time, they weren't just studying the classics. They were also looking into the Bible itself, analyzing its rhetorical power.
Like uncovering the art of persuasion in the sacred texts.
Yeah. And unlike Maimonides, who saw biblical rhetoric as a way to make philosophy accessible to the masses, Renaissance thinkers saw it as a high art, essential for intellectual life.
So rhetoric gets elevated to this whole new level.
It does. And the idea of beauty transformed too. Medieval thinkers, following Maimonides, they saw beauty as more subjective. It's what we agree on, what we find pleasing. But in the Renaissance, beauty becomes this objective ideal. It's something that can move us intellectually, that can inspire us.
It's not just about personal taste anymore, it's something more universal.
Exactly. And you see this new appreciation for beauty in all these different areas. Philosophy, poetry, visual art. And Abrabanel is very much a part of this movement.
And what about the imagination? You said it was viewed with suspicion in earlier periods.
Yeah, after Plato, philosophers were kind of wary of the imagination. They thought it could lead us astray, create illusions, but then they also knew it played a role in prophecy. They saw the prophet as this kind of philosopher with a really good imagination, able to explain difficult ideas in ways that everyone could understand.
So the imagination could be used for good or for evil, depending on who is wielding it.
Right. But Abrabanel, he's not so worried about keeping philosophy secret. So he actually puts more value on the imagination and the images it creates. And he's influenced by Ficino and the Neoplatonists who really believed in the power of the soul. He even says that the artist's imagination can be a channel for divine inspiration.
So the imagination becomes this bridge between the human and the divine.
In a way, yeah. It's a big shift from that earlier suspicion. And then the question is, how does he connect all this to his bigger picture of the universe?
Yeah, how does beauty fit into his cosmology and metaphysics?
Well, for him, beauty is this unifying force, this dynamic principle that runs through the entire cosmos. And since beauty inspires love, it connects everything. You get this incredible web of relationships from the physical world to the spiritual realm. He sees the potential for beauty in everything as a reflection of God's infinite beauty.
It's like a cosmic tapestry woven together with threads of beauty.
I love that. And to explain the origin of this beautiful universe, he offers two models. The first one comes from Islamic Neoplatonism. He's drawing on thinkers like Ghazali, Avicenna, and Maimonides.
Those are some heavy hitters in the world of philosophy.
They are. So this model says that God, out of love for his own infinite beauty, emanates the first intelligence. And this first intelligence, contemplating God and its own beauty, it gives rise to more levels of intellect, and then you get the celestial spheres.
It's like a cascade of creation driven by love and beauty.
Exactly. And it all comes from God's love for his own beauty. Eventually, you get the active intellect, which is often linked to the moon, and it becomes the guiding force for the material world, shaping forms, and even the human intellect. And guess what? It does this through contemplating beauty.
So even at the cosmic level, beauty is the driving force. And what about the second model?
The second model comes from Plotinus, that Platonian triad. You have the one, which is God, the source of all beauty. Then you have the realm of intellect, which is where intelligible beauty exists. And then the realm of soul, which gives birth to the physical universe, based on that blueprint of intelligible beauty.
It's like an architect's plan becoming a physical reality.
That's a great way to think about it. And Abrabanel gets really creative here. He takes this Platonian model and combines it with Kabbalistic ideas to make sense of the creation story in Genesis.
He's bringing together all these different strands of thought.
He is. In his synthesis, God is the masculine principle, and intelligible beauty is the feminine principle. And the world comes into being through God's loving contemplation of wisdom. But what's really cool is that he emphasizes the importance of the physical world. It's not something to be rejected or escaped from. It's a necessary stage for us as humans.
He's saying we need the physical world to learn and to grow.
Exactly. We need it to experience beauty in its physical forms, so we can then transform that experience into spiritual understanding. It's all part of this ascent back to the divine source.
It's like a spiritual boot camp almost.
Yeah.
So how does this all tie into his understanding of the human mind, our psychology, and even the possibility of prophecy?
Great question. His psychology and his theory of prophecy, they flow directly from this cosmological framework and his focus on beauty. He divides the senses into two groups: the material senses, touch, taste, and smell, and the spiritual senses, hearing and sight.
So some senses are more attuned to the spiritual realm?
Exactly. And hearing and sight, they can move beyond the purely physical. He loves hearing because it's linked to rhetoric, to learning. But sight, that's the most important one for him.
The eyes are the windows to the soul, as they say.
He might have agreed with that. He introduces this concept of forza oculare, which means ocular power. It's how we grasp spiritual things. Just like physical light allows us to see, the divine intellect illuminates our minds when we understand something.
So sight becomes this metaphor for how we understand the universe.
Yes, we move from seeing physical objects to understanding these abstract, intangible concepts, these intelligibles.
It's like a higher level of seeing, a seeing with the mind's eye. And prophecy, does that fit into this idea of forza oculare?
Yes, prophecy is this special way of perceiving, of understanding. He talks about three kinds of vision: God seeing himself, angels seeing God, but not as equals, and then human vision.
And human vision is the weakest of the three, I imagine.
Right, we can only see the divine indirectly. But prophecy, that's when we get closer to the divine. It's like a temporary merging with the agent intellect, which he sees as part of the angelic realm. It allows prophets to see divine beauty, though not directly, more like a reflection in a mirror.
It's like catching a glimpse of the divine through a glass, darkly.
Exactly. And he believes, like Maimonides, that Moses' prophecy was purely intellectual. But even so, he describes it with these incredibly vivid images. like Moses seeing the most beautiful figure of God.
So the visual language is still important, even if the experience itself is purely intellectual.
Absolutely. And to understand how all this works in humans, he divides this into three parts: body, soul, and intellect. The soul is the key, it's the mediator. He says it has two faces, one looking towards the intellect, one towards the body. So it translates between those two realms.
It's like the bridge between the physical and the spiritual.
Right. Okay, so we've covered beauty. Now let's talk about love. You said Abrabanel has a different take on love than traditional philosophers.
So how does he break from tradition? What's different about his view of love?
Traditional philosophers, going back to Plato and Aristotle, they said love comes from lack, from a feeling that something is missing. We love what we don't have.
So we're drawn to what completes us.
Right, and because of that, they thought God, who is perfect and self-sufficient, couldn't love. He has everything already, nothing's missing. And Aristotle even said that love is asymmetrical. The less perfect thing loves, the more perfect thing more intensely.
Like a moth to a flame, almost.
Exactly. But Abrabanel, he challenges this whole idea. He's like, why can't God love? Why do we assume that?
And is it because of the Renaissance influence, this different way of thinking?
Partly, yes. Remember, the Renaissance was all about emphasizing God's creative power, his love for his creation. So Abrabanel criticizes those earlier philosophers for not giving love to God, for focusing too much on human love and ignoring the divine.
He's saying, hey, God is love. How can you leave that out?
Exactly. And for Abrabanel, love isn't just about filling a gap. It's about connection, about this desire to be united with the source of beauty. And this union, it sparks creativity. Think about God creating the universe out of love for his own beauty. Or an artist creating a masterpiece inspired by beauty. Or a philosopher formulating a beautiful theory driven by love for truth.
So love isn't passive. It's an active, generative force.
Yeah, absolutely. And he rethinks human love too. He agrees with Maimonides that the intellect's love for God is a primary form of human love, but he goes further. He gives love back to God.
Which was a pretty radical idea, wasn't it?
Yeah. He wasn't the first to do this, though. He draws on Crescus, who argued that love isn't necessarily about lack. He saw it as linked to God's creative energy. But Abrabanel really develops this idea. He talks about divine love as God's wisdom, wanting to manifest his beauty in the creation of the universe, and also wanting the universe to return to him.
So this whole process of creation and return is driven by love, both God's love and the universe's love for God.
Exactly. And he doesn't see sensual love as bad. It's not a distraction or something to be overcome. It can actually be a starting point, a path towards the divine. And while he emphasizes God's intellect, he also talks about God's beauty.
And that's something new, something that sets him apart from thinkers like Crescas and Maimonides.
Yes. And he has this amazing metaphor, the circle of love. Il circolo degli amati.
Tell me about it.
It's this grand cosmic cycle that starts with the divine. God, out of love, creates the universe. This is like a paternal love. And then each level of being shares some of its beauty with the level below it, all the way down to the material world. But then there's a reverse movement. The inferior things, they love the superior things because they're drawn to their perfection, their beauty. They want to be united with that.
It's like a dance between the divine and the created, a constant exchange of love and beauty.
A beautiful image, isn't it? And this whole cycle, this emanation and return, it's fueled by love, by this longing for beauty. It's what holds the entire cosmos together.
So what's the point of all this? What's the goal of human life within this circle of love?
The goal, the ultimate purpose, is for our intellect to be totally immersed in divine knowledge. We find our happiness, our fulfillment, in contemplating God's beauty.
So it's about uniting our intellect with the divine mind.
Exactly. And he uses the image of a mirror.
How does that fit in?
The mirror is a classic symbol in philosophy. It represents the perfected soul, the perfected intellect. Imagine a perfect mirror. It reflects everything exactly as it is. So a perfected intellect, it perfectly reflects the higher principles of the universe. It sees God as he truly is.
It's like having a crystal clear vision of the divine.
Right. But then he contrasts that with an imperfect mirror, one that's cracked or smudged. It only shows a distorted reflection. He's saying our intellect is like that sometimes. We only see a partial, imperfect image of the divine. But through practice, through study, we can polish our intellectual mirror, so to speak, so we can better reflect the divine light.
So even though we're limited, we can still strive for a clearer understanding of God.
Exactly. And he has this really interesting view of the natural world. It's not something to be rejected. It's important even for our spiritual journey.
And that seems different from other medieval thinkers, right?
It is. He sees the physical world as a vessel for divine power. He even compares the earth to heaven's beloved consort.
So it's not about escaping the world, but finding the divine within it.
Exactly. He uses that same analogy that Maimonides used, comparing matter to a harlot. But he puts a positive spin on it. He says this adulterous love is what gives the world its beauty, its diversity.
He's celebrating the world's imperfections, in a way.
I think so. The whole universe for him is a giant mirror reflecting God's beauty. It's how we come to understand those higher divine truths. It's like,